In this lesson, you're going to learn more about the Aboriginals in Australia and also what's known as a dark and dramatic chapter of Australia's recent history, referred to as the Stolen Generation. The competence aims in focus are drøfte kultur- og samfunnsforhold i flere engelskspråklige land, drøfte tekster av og om urfolk i engelskspråklige land. Before we begin explaining the term the stolen generation, let's have a look at the Aboriginals' history. The Aboriginals are the indigenous peoples of Australia. They're the native inhabitants or the first Australians. They've actually been living on the Australian continent for somewhere between 40,000 and 70,000 years. The Aboriginals traditionally have had a nomadic way of living, which means that they have moved around fishing, hunting, gathering food, and living in smaller tribes. The Aboriginal life and beliefs are closely connected to nature. The Aboriginals believe in a spiritual world, a world where each hill and rock and every tree and animal has its own power. So they also believe that the world links them to their forefathers and the forces of creation. The Aboriginals have had no real concept of land ownership, much like the Native Americans. But still, to be deprived of land was much worse for the Aboriginals than being deprived of property, because it also meant a loss of identity and a spiritual death. When the Europeans began to arrive in the 1700s, the Aboriginals, like many indigenous people in countries that were colonized by the Europeans, they died in large numbers. Quite a few were killed, but up till 90% actually died of diseases that the Europeans brought with them. Diseases like measles, or chickenpox, or smallpox. Throughout history, the Aboriginals were mistreated by the Europeans, mostly because they were seen as an inferior race. Many colonists believed that the Aboriginals would die out because they were inferior and that the superior race, meaning the Europeans or the English, would continue living on the continent. In Australia, there's been no official segregation policies like you've seen in, for example, the US with the African Americans or in South Africa with the apartheid, but in practice, many Aboriginals have been treated as unequal, having lesser opportunities when it comes to education and work, for example. In the 1960s, Aboriginal activism began, inspired much by the civil rights movement in the USA. People became more concerned with the way that Aboriginals were being treated and demanded equal rights. Today, there are about 500,000 Aborigines living in Australia. Some of them live modern lives in modern cities, while others live a more traditional lifestyle in the outbacks. The Stolen Generation. As I said, the Stolen Generation refers to a very dark, very sad, traumatic chapter in Australia's recent history, because it refers to the Aboriginal children who were forcefully taken from their homes by the Australian government and put in institutions or foster homes. Targets has this definition of the term. The Stolen Generation is a term used for the Aboriginal children who were taken from their parents by the Australian government and placed in institutions, orphanages, missions, or white foster families from the late 19th century to the late 1960s. Who, how, and why? The Australian government focused mostly on removing so-called half-castes. This is a derogative term that you would offend Aboriginals by using, but at the time half-castes meant children who had one white parent and one Aboriginal parent. Also light-skinned Aboriginals were taken. The children were ideally taken between birth and the age of 2. Think about that, between birth and the age of 2. They were ideally moved very far away from their families so that they had no chance of communicating or seeing them. Their Aboriginal names were changed to English names, and they were not allowed to speak their native language or practice or even learn about their Aboriginal culture. So you have an entire generation that's stolen not only from their families but also deprived very much of their culture. Now the government's aim was to make the children more European. In the end, they wanted to assimilate or really extinguish Aboriginals. Some were also removed because of maltreatment. The Aboriginals had lesser living conditions, were poor, didn't have any jobs, etc. But the government's main aim was, as I said, to make the children more European because they thought that was the correct thing to do because the Europeans saw themselves as a more superior race and that the European way of living was more correct, appropriate, better than the Aboriginal. Children were moved to institutions, missions, and foster homes. On the right-hand side, you can see a picture of girls from the Cootamundra Aboriginal Girls' Home. The purpose was to teach the Aboriginal children the European way of living. They were also given the task to Christianize the children and to prepare the children to work as servants and laborers, because that's what very many of them ended up doing. If you have a look at this statistics from a website called A Guide to Australia's Stolen Generation, you can see the reasons why Aboriginal girls were taken. And the number one reason was to use her as a servant, send her to service. The second reason was because she was neglected. Other reasons could mean simply being an Aboriginal female. Sometimes no reason was given at all. Sometimes it was explained that the Aboriginal girls would have better living conditions or that it was for their own welfare, to get her away from the community, that she was being of an age to be apprenticed, to protect her morality, or because her mother was in hospital. So how many children were taken? Well, the Australian Human Rights Commission estimate that from 1919 till 1970, about 10 till 33% of the Aboriginal children were forcefully removed from their homes. This means that the stolen generation refers to thousands and thousands of children. Justice and reconciliation. In the 1960s, as I've already mentioned, inspired by the civil rights movement in the USA, people began questioning the treatment of the Aboriginal people and they demanded change. In 1967, the first Aboriginals were allowed to vote. And between 1995 and 1997, an inquiry was held to document what had happened to Aboriginal children. And its findings were published in the Bringing Them Home report in 1997. Now, actually, many white Australians were shocked by the report because they hadn't been aware of the scope of the abuse that these children and their families had suffered. And the report also recommended an annual Sorry Day. So, in 1998, the first National Sorry Day was held. Hundreds of thousands wrote apologies or participated in walks to promote greater understanding between the Indigenous and the non-Indigenous Australians. The Sorry Day was then renamed National Healing Day in 2005 to focus on the need for reconciliation. In the Sydney Olympics in 2000, about 400,000 people walked across the Sydney Harbour Bridge in what's known as the Walk of Reconciliation. And also at the Games themselves, the Olympic flame was lit by the Aboriginal athlete Cathy Freeman. So quite a few things were done to try and reconcile the Indigenous and the non-Indigenous people. But still, what many people felt was missing was an official apology from the government. Now, the government for quite some time didn't want to give this apology because they thought it really wasn't their fault. It was something they thought was in the past that they had no responsibility for. But in 2008, the newly elected Prime Minister Kevin Rudd apologized for the Australian government's treatment of the Aboriginals and the stolen generation. In his speech, he said, among other things, "For the pain, suffering and hurt of these stolen generations, their descendants, and for their families left behind, we say sorry." And in this way, the officials closed the chapter of the stolen generation. Because this historical event is this recent, it still affects very many Aboriginals and Australians. But with Kevin Rudd apologizing officially, this was at least a big step towards reconciliation in Australia. The sources I've used in this lesson is a guide to Australia's stolen generation, targets and gateways.